Me and my sister arrived in Cambridge from Caen by the Kindertransport. I don't remember who organised our foster homes, but I vaguely remember the names Mrs. Burkill and Mrs. Hutton. But we really fell on our feet. They sent us to Church Street, Chesterton, to live with Miss Maria Susan Rickard.
Miss Rickard wasn't much older than we sisters, but she lived in this enormous house.
She had a big heart, and a huge garden, with a tennis court. I've never seen a house so big.
She was unmarried, but had a housekeeper, gardener, cook, and countless cats. Then we came.
Miss Rickard was very kind, but correct in an English way. Affectionate, in her own way. She was very active in the Girls' Guides and encouraged us to join.
We met lots of new English friends that way. Not content with looking after us, I remember that she took in evacuee boys from the East End.
She took in those rather naughty boys that no one else wanted. Somehow we got a place at the Perse Girls. I remember all the English girls laughing at me when teacher asked me my shoe size.
39, miss.
39, you must be a giantess.
A few days before war broke out, guess what? Our parents arrived in England to Cambridge. At first we weren't able to move in with them, so we stayed with Miss Rickard for over a year. Then we moved in with our parents here in Cambridge.
I got my school certificate and became a teacher. Now I'm 90 years old and I live in Cardiff, but I still remember my happy days in Cambridge. Mrs. Burkill, Miss Rickard, or as we call her, Auntie. Thank you so much.
We were lucky, in a way. This is my little sister Ilse, and we arrived in Cambridge in 1939 on one of the last trains from Prague. I say we were lucky. We said goodbye to our parents at the Wilson station in Prague, not realising that we would never see them again. Lucky because we got to stay together. Lucky because we came to Cambridge, one of the country's finest refugee committees. And of course, we didn't know Mrs. Greta Burkill, but she certainly knew us.
She seemed very kind, always smiling, and she made wonderful cakes.
At first, Mrs. Burkill found us a home in Glebe Road, but I think they found it hard to cope with two strange children.
And I couldn't speak English, and I didn't know how to lay the table.
Mrs. Burkill must have known we were unhappy, because later she found us another home in Trumpington. A friend of hers, I think. But again, things didn't turn out well. So the committee suggested that we split up. I said no. I promised Mutty that I'd take care of Ilse. And so Mrs. Burkill found us a home in a hostel. There I could look after my sister, and there were good people to take care of her when I was at school, or later became an apprentice.
And I remember there was a lovely teddy bear in the hostel.
I came from Austria in 1939. I remember my father took me to the station in Vienna. It was the dead of night. The Nazis didn't want the local people to see us Jews being so upset. Papa wasn't allowed on the platform, and so we had to say goodbye in some drafty hall. We shook hands and said, "Fritz, be a good boy in England, learn English, be polite to your host family, but never forget your German or us." How could I forget Papa, and especially if he said we would meet again in a few months? I don't remember much about my journey across Europe and in that ship to Harwich, but I do remember the holiday camp. Yes, a holiday camp. Werner's. No English family had come to take me in, and so I and lots of other Jewish boys and girls were housed in a holiday camp in a place called Dovercourt. It was winter, there was no heating, and the chalets were freezing cold. I remember stuffing a hot water bottle up my cardigan to keep me warm. The food was horrible. white bread which looked like plastic and didn't taste of anything, and tea with milk. Tea with milk? Then in the morning we would get porridge. How can anyone eat this? It's like eating sticky glue. Anyway, after a few weeks I was sent to Cambridge. This lady, a Miss Hartree, met me at the station and took me to my foster home in one of the villages. She got me a school place at the Paris. I have no idea who paid for it, not the foster family, who are quite poor. During the term I boarded at Hillel House, a Jewish hostel in Glebe Road. That was quite fun, although I was not used to eating kosher food. We were not religious back in Austria. Miss Hartree was very kind, but quite frightening. I don't think anyone would dare to say no to her.
I left my mother's apartment in Breslau on the 2nd of May, 1939. I was 10 years old, only 10. And so I came to Cambridge with 150 other Jewish children. The Quakers helped to get me out. The usual route, through Holland, shipped to Harwich, Liverpool Street, and so I came to Cambridge. Well, Stapleford actually, to my foster parents in that little village. To a cosy house, full of books. He was a teacher, she a housewife, who had very strong social conscience. Very correct, not very warm, but they treated me as they treated their own children. Firm but fair. He'd tell me off for being bad at rounders or dropping a teapot, but she'd usually stick up for me. Of course, I was very unhappy thinking I'd never see my mother again. I was sent to Perth School. Who paid for that, I just don't know. And in the term time, I stayed at the Jewish boarding house in Glebe Road. And slowly, my English grammar got better. So much that I even started to forget some of my German. I found out my mother had survived. Meeting her again was very emotional for me. But I had forgotten how to speak to her. She was very upset. She also lived in Cambridge, and would sometimes come to our house in Stapleford for tea. The Stapleford family were very good to me. People in England who knew what was going on in Germany and wanted to do their bit. After the war, my mother and I went to America. I think my new brothers and sisters missed me, but for my mother and I, a new life awaited.
I was already an orphan when I came to Cambridge on the Kindertransport. My mum had died when I was little, and my dad not long after. So a poor uncle and aunt took us in. But when the Jews lost their jobs and their businesses after the Nazis came to power, they found it impossible to look after me and my brother. So we came on the Kindertransport. My older brother got a job in London, and I stayed there with the family. Then I got a scholarship to go to Bedford College, where I did pretty well. But then my brother had a terrible accident, and sadly he died. I was now on my own. So that's when Professor and Mrs. Burkle took me in. I went to live with them in Chilser Road, and I stayed with them all my life. And in 1947, I even took their name, and I was very happy to call them Mummy and Daddy. I can't thank them enough for all they did, and they even helped me get a scholarship to go to Trinity College, where I went on to become a lecturer in maths, just like Professor Charles Burkle, my father actually.
I was born in 1924 in Cologne. Growing up a Jewish child in Germany was quite a happy experience. That is, until Hitler came to power. Suddenly one was shunned, spat at in the street. People would shout horrible things at you. Dirty Jew, that sort of thing. And so my parents put me on the Kindertransport to England. My brother was already here, so he met me at Liverpool Street Station. I remember the first thing he made me do was read out an advertisement poster to test my level of English. And so I read, "Bovril is good for you." I had no idea what it meant, but I read it well enough. After some unhappy experiences, I was offered a home with Dr. Robert and Mrs. Sybil Hutton of Chaucer Road. They were so kind, and Mrs. Hutton saw to it that I got a proper education. We weren't allowed to attend the state schools in Germany, so I missed out on a lot. But I spent happy years at the Cambridge Central High School for Girls on Long Road. Mr. and Mrs. Hutton became like parents to me. I remember writing to my dear father, "Papa, they are marvellous people." Mr. and Mrs. Hutton were so kind. My father knew I was being well looked after, and knowing that means a lot to me. I remember Mrs. Hutton was an ARP warden, and whenever the sirens went off, she donned her special uniform and galoshes, hopped on her noisy little motorbike, and dashed off to the Red Cross station in Trumpington. Later, I became a nurse and returned to Cambridge with my own family to thank the wonderful Huttons for everything they had done for me.
Me and my family live in a farm in Caldecott, about 8 miles outside of Cambridge. Our neighbours live in the old rectory nearby. Apparently, they're Jews, and the old guy is a scientist who got kicked out of Germany because of his religion. Now that doesn't make sense to me. Anyway, one day this girl turns up, Marianne, their niece or something, about my age. I see her in the garden and ask her if she wants to go fishing with us. She has this funny accent. Her mum and dad got locked up in one of them concentration camps, and I said, "What do they do to get locked up?" And he said, "Nothing, lad, just locked up for what they are," and that didn't make sense to me. Anyway, she could speak English well enough to understand me and my brother, and we'd run down to the river sometimes and she'd always beat us to it. I think she was some kind of athlete because she went to this posh school in Cambridge and she was in all the sports teams. And we played cricket sometimes and she'd always bowl me out. A member of the Perth girls cricket team. Imagine that. She was game. My mum said a tomboy. One thing though, she was no good at fishing.
One day, Mama said, "Darling, how would you like some new sisters?" And I said, "But I already have 2 sisters." And she said, "Well, these are very special children, girls who have been separated from their own ma and pa. They've asked us to look after them." Well, at first I was a bit miffed at the thought. Apart from us, the house was always full with refugees from Germany, Austria, Lord knows where else. Sometimes it was a bit hard to get Mama's attention, and now 2 children to look after. Anyway, I knew Mama's mind was made up and said something like, "Oh, it's all right, I suppose, as long as they keep their hands off my model planes." Anyway, one day these 2 girls turned up, couldn't speak a jot of English, and didn't understand a word I said, no matter how loud I shouted at them. They didn't seem too bad. I'd never met a Jew before. There weren't many in Cambridge, and they seemed quite nice. To be honest, I did feel a bit sorry for them. One day I even let them play with my model aeroplane. When winter came, one of the girls turned out to be an excellent skater, even better than me. Some kind of Czech junior champ, apparently. We'd have races on the frozen wreck in Newnham, and she'd always beat me. What a rum go. Beaten by a foreigner. And a girl.
The children we helped. It was a rush job. The rush started in November 1938. Kristallnacht. The news of that terrible night went through Britain like a sort of electric current. Every little town and every little village said, "We must save the children." A fantastic thing. People who would not have thought of the Nazis or anything else, when they heard about this murder and burnings, this was the reaction. Of course, we were early on the scene. I started it, and I got Sybil Hutton to join me. All sorts of people joined us. like Mrs. Ava Hartree. She had been mayor of Cambridge, you know. And there was a Miss Sturge. She was a very good old-fashioned Quaker. We made 2 promises: that we would bring the child up in the faith of its father and mother, and that we would reunite the families as soon as possible. And we kept that very faithfully. We were in luck in Cambridge. I went around the town with lots of pretty photographs, and wherever I met a friend, I would say, "Wouldn't you like a nice refugee child?" But if the child wasn't happy, and our instincts were good, then we would move the child without delay. I don't know where I found all the time. I spent the mornings as a Red Cross lady and the afternoons as a refugee worker. And in between, I looked after my family. My husband said, "With all those refugees to look after, at least you won't spoil our own children." I was really mainly interested in the children. But I got involved in absolutely everything. But education was my priority. They left that to me. I got the children into the Lees, the Perth, the county school, Homerton, and Cambridge Technical School. Education was to be their ticket to freedom. Did the refugees fit in? Oh, Jesus College gave us a very large house in Hills Road. I do not think we paid a rent. It had a canteen, and we had reading rooms, and on the top floor were our offices, and they could have dances there. We, of course, were very keen to get the English people to come in and visit the refugee children, and invite them out, and make the social contact, which was really very important. Of course, there were those refugees who wanted to forget all about their past life and start a new life. But there were others who could not forget, and who could not settle in the sort of way, the British way, at all. Poor dears. We never thought we would have them for 8, 10, or even forever. We simply thought it was a way of helping the parents. Of course, the parents showed a fantastic trust in complete strangers, people not of their religion, entrusting their children to us. I had 2,000 children go through my hands. I think the refugee children was the most satisfying work I ever did. Why? Because on the whole, they were such marvelous children. Were the English families kind? Oh, yes. In fact, it was very touching. A foster mother might say to me, "Poor little Hans has no parents in this country, so we must do our very best for him, even though he is an absolute little horror." It was fantastic work.